definition of terms is commonly found after the theoretical framework or that section or heading that's titled theoretical framework. Your proposal or dissertation might be titled conceptual framework. It's the same location for the definition of terms that would follow conceptual framework if you're not using a theoretical framework. But theoretical framework tends to be the more commonly found heading title in a proposal and dissertation. This would also be about 2/3 of the way through your work in chapter 1. So it's not early in the chapter, but it's later near the end of the chapter. The definition of terms is provided in your work to help you ensure that you are communicating effectively with the audience, and it helps to eliminate any vagueness. You have to keep in mind that people may read your dissertation who are not from your career field. They may not even be in your industry at all. This may actually be your dissertation chair and committee members. It may be the person at your university who approves your dissertation. They may not understand everything the way you do, and this is your opportunity to make sure that if there is any case of terminology that's in your work that's not commonly understood by everybody, that you have that opportunity in this section to provide the definitions so people can look to this section and understand what the context is of the word or the words that you're applying. The definition of terms would not be commonly referred to words as we might find in a dictionary. These are non-commonly referred words. These might be certain terms that people use in a certain industry, and not everybody would understand them. You don't want to put a lot of words in this section, definition of terms, that everybody understands. That's not the purpose. The purpose is for unique words or unique phrases that are pertinent to your research, and therefore most likely are those that are not found in a dictionary, or might be found in a dictionary but you're applying it with perhaps a different connotation to it. Non-commonly understood phrases. If you happen to be in the military or the government or in a specific technical industry, you may be using terms in your work that other people don't understand. So it could be more than just a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a meaning that other people are not aware of. This is the importance of providing these types of terms and phrases in your work in this section. As I mentioned, it might be unique to industry terminology. For example, if you happen to be doing work on improving quality in the workplace and you mention something about Six Sigma in your work, not everybody understands what Six Sigma is. That's a terminology that's specific to process improvement types of work. And so therefore, if you're doing that in the technology field, you would want to highlight that and bring that to the attention of the definition of terms. The definition of terms helps you, but more importantly gives guidance to the reader and moves them from the general to the specific. For example, short-term goals. If you're writing about goals and how to attain goals within your work, short-term goals can be vague. For some people that means less than a year. Some people might mean that to be less than 2 years. For other people it could be a 5-year time frame. So the idea being that from short-term goals you would define it in the definition section on what you mean by short-term goals. If you mean a short-term goal that would be planned and accomplished within 24 months, then the reader knows when they read short-term goals in your work that that's exactly what you mean, and it takes away any question about what is the intention of you, the author, in your work. Could be categories. For example, baby boomers. There are many different sources that have different years for what a baby boomer is. So the reality of what you would have in your work is the definition of baby boomers, and you would give the exact years of beginning to end, and then you would cite it. I actually have an example of that from one of my mentees that will follow later in this lesson. But whenever you're talking about categories that could be subjective and they're not commonly understood to be true by everybody everywhere, you want to use that information in the definition of terms section of your proposal and dissertation. Also, operational definitions of variables. If you're doing a quantitative study and you have variables, For example, you may have as one of your variables transformational leadership. Now, depending on which author one has read, transformational leadership is not always defined the exact same way by everybody. So in the case of your study, if you're using transformational leadership, you would define transformational leadership as you mean it and cite it by the author who has provided that term or that definition for you and how it's applied to your study. Technical terms. Many times students are writing in technical jargon, and that's not necessarily helpful for the person who is not familiar with your industry. So for example, if you happen to be in the technology industry and you're working with computers and you're talking about a semiconductor, some people know what that means, others do not. The importance is that when you have technical terms in your work is to take the most important ones that you use on a regular basis or those that could be defined subjectively and then put those into your definition of terms. In this case, again, you would put the word semiconductor, you would put a description of what you mean by that term, and then a citation that supports that definition. Conceptual terms. If you're doing a study that happens to deal with people's feelings or people's perceptions or other information similar to something that you can't necessarily measure, for example, feeling productive. That might mean one thing to one person, but yet it could mean something to somebody else. What we want to know is this conceptual term and how do you define it for your study? Feeling productive. It could mean that somebody, when they're done with their work, that they feel good about themselves. They feel good about their workplace as compared to just feeling productive based on their annual performance appraisal. It depends on what you mean and how you apply it. And the whole idea behind using these definition of terms is so that the reader, the audience of your work, understands how you applied the terms that you're using. The military or government terminology is another area where you might want to consider having definition of terms included. For example, somebody may not know what the difference is between an enlisted person or an officer or a sergeant or other terms and jargon that comes from the military and government. There's also a lot of acronyms that are used by the military and government, and if you're using a lot of them in your work, the person who is not familiar with the military or the government or those terms may not understand what you mean. So therefore, the importance is of having the definition of terms, again, written out so that when somebody else reads your work, they can understand better what you mean. Keep in mind the audience who reads your work. This is challenging when you're writing, I understand this, but you have to consider and be forward thinking that once your work is published, other people will read your work and they need to be able to have a sense of clarity from what you were writing. I find this important as a doctorate student or a doctoral candidate writes their work, that if they have too much technical jargon on there, they have too many conceptual terms, they have too many terms that somebody doesn't understand, their actual doctoral dissertation chair, committee members, and university people who review your work at the IRB or any other level may not understand your work. And while it may seem like everybody should know what you're talking about because they may work in your actual same degree program, that may not necessarily be true. The definition of terms format. Well, for the definitions, I'd like to be able to say there is a set format, but there is not. What's important is what you put in there. Matter of fact, not even my own mentees from one student to the next have the exact same format. There's nothing wrong with that, but I encourage you to check with your dissertation chair or your university guidelines because they may actually prescribe a format. Most universities that I'm familiar with require the definition of terms. They don't have a set format for it though. I will share several different formats from the lessons that I provide that have examples from my students. What's important is the content that you put in there, that you give the term and you give a definition and you give a citation. Ideally, I recommend that you put these definitions of terms in this heading in alphabetical order. Some people believe that they should put it in there in order that they appear in the document. Perhaps if your university has given you guidance to do it that way, that's fine. I've only seen it that way in a couple different situations. 98% of the time, I've seen it where they're all in alphabetical order. My suggestion to you is if you're not sure, put them in alphabetical order, and that way you'll have them at least in a format that's understandable. Again, these are not common dictionary words. You wouldn't use words such as a leader or something that deals with psychology if it's the standard definition that you would find in a dictionary. I always recommend cite reliable sources for each term. For each definition that you have, put a citation in. You can paraphrase or you can quote it. And in the examples I'm going to show in a few seconds, you'll see both of them. But the importance is that you're relying on a source to take it back to understand how somebody else meant it. Now, the examples I'm going to provide are from my dissertation mentees who have gone on and graduated. They were approved on the first pass through their proposal and dissertation in most cases because they paid attention to detail and they were very good consumers of research, as well as understanding the format and the needs to be able to get through their approval processes. Each of my mentees have given me consent to use their work. They own the copyright of it. I'm just sharing it with you here as an example to help you learn. So the first example I'll share is from Dr. Maria Puente. Her dissertation is titled Selling: The Lived Experiences of Domestic Property and Casualty Insurance Leaders. Now in her section, she starts it out literally with a little bit of background information, and there's nothing wrong with this. You can do this if you want to. Some universities and some dissertation chairs require it. By putting this paragraph in here, it helps the reader to understand that the author of the work has a good understanding of why they're putting terms in here. So she wrote, definitions provide clarity to the meaning of specific terms used in the study. And there's a citation from Creswell. The insurance industry is a complex, multifaceted industry of products and services. For the purposes of this study, operational definitions have been specified to clarify the terms used. So here's a great reason why you should use definitions of terms. So to specify and to ensure the clarity of the terms that are used for the reader. She used this format where she used domestic and she put a period, then a space. Now domestic is highlighted. This may not be necessarily in true alignment with the APA guidance on when you should do a bold font or not, but in some cases it's okay. And she goes on to give her definition of what domestic refers to in her work here. Domestic refers to insurers incorporated under the laws of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. So when she's saying domestic, we know it means the people in Puerto Rico, whereas perhaps if you were living in California and you wrote domestic, it may not necessarily mean the same. So now perhaps you get a better understanding of exactly why we need the definition of terms. Again, she adds here, selling. Selling means communicating with people and serving the needs and motivations of people. And she highlighted the source from Hopkins 2010. If you know anything about Tom Hopkins, he's a great salesperson that has been around for many years as a subject matter expert, and his books are read by most salespeople. So again, here she's giving the terms in bold with a period, with a space, and then giving a sentence with a citation. Now, Dr. Ellen Beatty, in her dissertation titled A Quantitative Correlational Study, Institutional Characteristics and Endowment Investment Performance Following the 2008-2009 Financial Crisis, provides her work as the same basic form as you saw before. Here she gives asset allocations, and she provides the definition, and she provides yet at the end another citation where if we're not sure or if we want to find more information, we can go back to Swanson 2009 and see the context that he or she has written that work in as well. But it provides us the definition of how she applied her work. It also helps us to better understand the definition, how it's applied in her work. Now, Dr. Joseph Hagee, in his dissertation titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study, provides his also with a bit of an introduction. and he provides the following are definitions of terms used throughout the study. These definitions serve as a guideline to standardize the understanding of the terms and their accurate use. So there's an example of him leading in with a little bit of information to help the reader realize why these terms are there. You never know. Somebody might be reading your work for the very first time and never really looked at other dissertations, and they may not be familiar with the content of one. So here you're kind of like educating the reader, if you will. And then he goes on to share his definition. Now here you see he has quoted Hofstede, and he provides the citation there and the page number. So where the others had paraphrased, here you have an example where Dr. Hagee decided it's best to quote this because this is exactly how it's applied based on Hofstede's work. Now, Dr. Patricia Schroeder, in her work, A Quantitative Correlation Study of Individualism, Collectivism, and Employee Innovation in Turkey, provided hers in a little bit different format. Here you see she still provides a sentence that talks about the definitions are provided to ensure reader understanding of the meaning and context of terminology used in the study. Just a very simple sentence. Now here, her format, you see she almost creates like a paragraph where she indents the word collectivism, also puts it in italics. It's also in bold font. Then she goes on to define it with 2 sentences and then cites an author from 2009. So here's yet another format where it's indented and in italics, the actual definition term itself, the term for the definition. Now in the final example, Dr. Suzanne B. Kristiniak, her dissertation titled Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a Qualitative Phenomenological Study, she provides the same thing, a little bit of an introduction. Terms used throughout the study require further clarification to understand the literature review and data analysis. And she goes on to provide alternative therapies. Now here you see she also indented, much like a paragraph would be, and has these highlighted. Now these 2 words are not in bold font like the others were. Again, there's no one way that says you have to do it a certain way. Then she goes on to provide the definition, the use of complementary therapies instead of conventional medical treatments. And then she gives a citation there that is from an organization that provides information to the medical community. Now she also provides here the definition of baby boomer generation. As I mentioned, there are many different authors who have different views on what year the baby boomer generation starts and ends. So she wanted to make sure that the reader understood exactly how she referred to baby boomers. So here she has baby boomer generation is a cultural term for anyone born between 1946 and 1964. Now what she did is she used the U.S. Census Bureau. I think that's probably the best because it's not subjective to individual authors but a government documentation. And then the other example she provides here is an acronym, CAM. And she provides acronyms used for complementary alternative medicine and then provides that citation there. So it may also be helpful to put an abbreviation if throughout your work you're going to use the abbreviation quite regularly. Many different reasons to have words used in this section definition of terms. That's commonly found in Chapter 1 of a proposal and dissertation.